feeling that something was going to be given to me there. Because I love studying history, not just biblical history, but American history. And I went looking for something, but came back with something else. And I'm going to share that with you. So first, real quick, I'm going to talk about, this is a layout of the tabernacle and the temple. I don't know if Jimmy's ever went into depth on this here, or anybody ever has. But this right here is the way in. Jesus says there's only one way in. This would be into the outer courts. Right here, the very first thing you hit is the altar of sacrifice. And the next thing in is the laver. Now you cannot enter into the holy place here, or the Holy of Holies, until you pass by those two things. Does that make sense? That's all you need to worry about for this message. In order to enter into the holy place, you have to pass by the altar and the laver, in that order. This is the way the temple was set up. It's the way the tabernacle was set up. It's that way for a reason. So, this is a picture, if you can make out of it, of a priest offering a sacrifice in Jerusalem. Now, if you know anything about end times prophecy, you know one day the temple will be rebuilt. It doesn't need to be because we are it, but the Bible tells you it will be rebuilt because that's where the Antichrist is going to go. So they're already starting these sacrifices up. This particular one, his name's Rabbi Baruch Khan, shown here making an offering of omer or barley sacrifice to God in the heart of Jerusalem. He has been appointed high priest by the Sanhedrin. Now, I don't know if you realize the importance of the fact that they're offering sacrifices in Jerusalem by a high priest appointed by the Sanhedrin. Those things hadn't existed for almost 2,000 years, but they exist now. We have a high priest that will be over the temple, and the Sanhedrin exists again, which means this thing's about to wrap up. In the book of Kings, I'm going to read this real quick and we're going to explain it. Adoniah was afraid of Solomon. So he arose and went and took hold of the horns of the altar. And it was told Solomon, saying, Indeed, Adoniah is afraid of King Solomon, for look, he has taken hold of the horns of the altar, saying, Let King Solomon swear to me today that he will not put his servant to death with the sword. Then Solomon said, If he proves himself a worthy man, not one hair of him shall fall to the earth. But if wickedness is found in him, he shall die. Now the backstory is with this is David's getting old, needs to appoint a new successor, a new king. There's some sibling rivalry going on. Adoniah and Joab want to take over and become king. Solomon gets appointed by David. Joab and Adoniah are plotting to kill Solomon. Solomon becomes king. Adoniah finds out. He knows he's going to kill me because he found out I was plotting to kill him. So he goes and grabs a hold of the altar. The horns of the altar are I'll show you, are these things right here. They're on the four corners. Now that's not just a common thing. You could actually die from doing that. And you'll find out later in the story how someone did. But what happened is, he was truly sorry for what he was trying to do to his brother. So he goes up and grabs a hold of the altar, the horns. Now if you look at this layout, the altar was a gigantic barbecue grill. They used to slaughter the animals and then they would cook them on that, burnt offering, and then they would eat it. It was a big festival. You would eat the lambs. Started in Passover, you couldn't let any of it be wasted. Also, it's high up off the ground. So, if you can imagine somebody going up there and grabbing a hold of one of those corner things and holding on and asking for sanctuary, first of all, it's going to be extremely hot, which means it's going to be uncomfortable. Right? Second of all, it's completely exposed. Everybody in the city would see that you are asking for salvation. You grab a hold of the altar, it's uncomfortable, and you're exposed. Because people know that you just don't go up there and do that unless you're asking for forgiveness. But it can only come from the priest or the king. Only the priest or king can grant salvation to someone holding on to the altar like that. In this case, it was Solomon. So Solomon spared his life. That translates to these altars. No matter how uncomfortable you get, sometimes you have to find an altar and grab on and ask for sanctuary from the king or the priest, which happens to be the same person.
Yes.
And it doesn't matter if you're exposed or not. You see how that works?
Yes.
That's why the altar is the first thing you pass. If you're wanting to head to the holy place, you have to hit the altar first. Right? If you want to hit the holy place, you have to pass by the altar first. Right? Later on, I'm going to show you this. This is me and Erica, my wife, in Israel. This is the city of Tel Dan. This is archaeological find of one of the altars. This happens to be the altar in Dan where they sacrificed to God in the wrong place, and it ultimately caused the split of Israel, the divorce. The northern and southern kingdom split in half. Here's a close-up view of it. You can see the stairs right here, and these would have been where the horns would have been right there. So you can see if someone went up there and grabbed that and said, "I need help," everybody would see it. And it would be extremely uncomfortable for that person to sit here and say, "I need an answer from the king, because he's the only one that can save me." Are you with me? Now this was built before the temple, so this is an ancient altar. It's a lot smaller. This one's made out of unhewn stones, like Moses would have made. Right here, but here's the horns. Still would be not a very pleasant thing to do. But you know, when you're coming before God, it's not always fun, especially if you're asking for sanctuary. If you're asking to be saved from something, it's not comfortable. And you got to expose some things about you. Cool? So the altar is the first thing you hit. Now I'm going to talk about the wrestling match of the century. Okay? Everybody know the story of Jacob when he wrestles the angel? Or Jesus, God, the man? We're going to read this real quick. Genesis 32. Jacob was left alone, and there wrestled with a man with him until the breaking of the day. And when he saw that he prevailed not against him, he touched the hollow of his thigh, and the hollow of Jacob's thigh was out of joint as he wrestled with him. And he said, "Let me go, for the day breaks." And he said, "I will not let you go, except you bless me." And he said unto him, "What is your name?" And he said, "Jacob." And he said, "Thy name shall be called no more Jacob, but Israel. For as a prince hast thou power with God and with man, and has prevailed." Read that before? It's kind of confusing because there's a lot of, and he said, he did this, and he did that, and he said, right? Kind of hard to figure out a little bit who you're talking about. Who's doing what? Because it's a lot of, he said this, and then he did this. So which one did it? Does anybody have any problem with me saying that that person, the man, the angel that Jacob was wrestling with, was a Old Testament form of Christ? We all know that because it was him that changed his name. So basically it was a form of the Word of God. Would you agree with me, Jimmy? So I'm going to insert that, the Word of God, where it's talking about the man, and put in the word Jacob where it's talking about him. And we're going to read this story again. So keep in mind that that person, because if you keep reading that story, Jacob says, I have seen God face to face and survived. And he called him Israel because you have wrestled with God. So that's the Word of God right there that he was wrestling with. So read it again with those things inserted because it'll make a little bit more sense. And Jacob was left alone, and there wrestled with the Word of God with him until the breaking of the day. And Jacob saw that he did not prevail against the Word of God, so the Word of God touched the hollow of his thigh. And the hollow of his thigh was out of joint, as Jacob wrestled with the Word of God. The Word of God said, let me go, for the day breaks. And Jacob said, I will not let you go, except you bless me. And the Word of God said to him, what is your name? And Jacob said, I'm Jacob. And the Word of God said, your name shall no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you've wrestled with God and prevailed. See how it changes it a little bit? Sometimes you need to get alone with the Word of God, no matter how uncomfortable it is, and wrestle with it. And when it says breaking of the day, that means morning. When the day breaks, it means when the sun comes up, light's being exposed, everything is going to be exposed. You will be exposed. Another thing in this story is the hollow of his thigh. Now, in Genesis 24, Abraham asks one of his servants to make sure he promises that his son will not marry somebody that's not a Hebrew. And he says, promise me this by putting your hand under my thigh. Kind of a weird, that's an ancient custom. But the hollow of your thigh is your inner thigh area, it's your groin. That is your center of balance. It's your center of gravity. So in this story, the Word of God threw his center of balance off. Threw him off balance. He wrestled with the Word of God until his center of gravity was disrupted. And then, the other thing is Jacob was a deceiver. That's what that word means. If you know the story of Jacob, he deceived his dad to get the blessing. He put hair on him, pretended he was his brother, and then he took the birthright from his brother for a bowl of soup. He was a trickster. He was the deceiver. Actually, the word Yaakov, Jacob, means deceiver. So he's wrestling here with the Word of God. Now, this is the creator of the universe. Do you really think a man can overpower the creator? No. So the whole time he's got a hold of this, the Word of God, and he's saying, let me go. What is your name? And it's only until Jacob reveals, I'm Jacob. I'm the deceiver. Then he said, okay, now you've admitted who you are. I can change your name. You got it. Now that you realize who you are, you're no longer that person because I'm going to make you somebody else. Does that make sense? Yes. Now think back to the tabernacle, the laver. The laver is a big gold bowl of water, polished. If you walk up to a shiny bowl of water and you look in it, what do you see? You see yourself. So once you've hit the altar and got verification from the king that you're saved, now you have to face yourself and admit who you are. You can't, the whole time that wrestle match was going on, he was trying to get Jacob to admit who he was. Because up until that point, he had snaked his way through all his other blessings. He snuck by other blessings by lying. And he had a hold of the Word of God this time, and he said, I ain't blessing you until you announce who you are to me. And then once he did that, God said, okay, now I can do something with you. You're no longer that. You will be the father of my nation. Right? But he had to come face to face with himself. That's what the laver does. That's in the I have this up here because in the ancient culture, your name was what your character was. In our Western culture, we name kids before they're born because we like the sound of it, and it becomes an identifier. But in those cultures, most babies weren't named until after they seen the character of the child. Or something happened like Noah or Methuselah. And those people, if you read it, it'll tell you, I'm going to name him this because of that. Very few times had a name ever been picked before. Christ was one of them. The angel said, you're going to name him Yeshua or Jesus because he's going to save. That's what that word means. Mary wouldn't have known that. So the angel had to tell the future, say, you're going to name him this. Or John the Baptist, you're going to name him that. Because their roles are already picked out. So in that culture, the character matters. So when God changes your name, he's changing your character.
Yes.
Who you are in here, not what you're called.
Yes.
That's the importance of that particular story. Now we're going to talk about some fun stuff. If I remember school, these kids have to go through school pretty soon. History. Anybody know what this is? Who said it? Mayflower. See? Somebody paid attention in class. Anybody know anything about the Mayflower? Pilgrims? It was full of pilgrims. Guys with funny hats with belt buckles on it. Walk around with weird pants looking for turkeys with flared out guns. Right? No. Sorry. This is what I found out when I went to Massachusetts. I went and spent some time studying American history. And by the way, if you don't know, America was founded as a biblical refuge, a place to worship God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I don't care what anyone says, this place was founded on those principles of the Bible. And this proves it. So we're going to watch a little 3-minute video to show you something, and then we're going to get into it. You guys remember that? And that story? Remember the Peanuts, right? Because they've been around since the 60s. Anyway, we're going to talk about this for just a few minutes. Because what happened in that little cartoon has affected a lot of things. This is a picture of the inside of the Mayflower, how crowded it was. And right now they're restoring it because it's almost up for the 400th anniversary in 2020. 1620 was when they crossed. Here's another view of it. Now, they're cleaning it up. The Pilgrims were Puritans, meaning that they read the Bible from its pure reading. They were against the Church of England, the Catholic Church. They wanted to read the Bible for what it actually says, the pure form of it. And therefore they were being persecuted by the Catholic Church, and then they were on the run. Right? So they fled from England over to Holland. They were persecuted, thrown in jail. They managed to get on the Mayflower, which was really a wine boat, and make it over here. There was 120 people on the boat. Some of them were merchants. 20 of them were slaves. They were white slaves, by the way. You won't hear that in school. Anyway, They made it over here to start a colony to worship God. That's why they were coming. On the way over, they hit a storm, and it changed the course of things. So I'm going to show you that this is I don't know if you can see that very well, but this is Plymouth Harbor. This is where this message was given to me. I specifically went over there to find one thing and came across something else. So I'm going to show you what this looks like. These are the graves of some of the pilgrims. Some of these graves date to 1690. It was quiet that day. In a minute here, I'm going to turn and find William Bradford's tomb. Now, if you know anything about history, that is Hebrew. That is actually right there, God's written out name in Hebrew from 1600s. Israel did not exist in the 1600s, and nobody spoke Hebrew. He died in 1657. This is another view right there. Now, why would a man from the 1600s have God's name written out in Hebrew on his tombstone? This actual monument was rebuilt in 1800, but Israel didn't exist then either. They didn't exist until 1948. So that's perplexing enough to think those guys knew about Hebrew and the Hebrew culture more than what we know. That proves they worship the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Right? That should be in schools, but it's not. Now, I knew this existed, but I wanted to see it for myself. But God didn't send me there for this. This was another grave I found out there. John Howland. Now, if you remember the video, he's the guy that fell off the boat. Has anybody heard of him? John Howland. I guarantee you after this, you will think about him more. Right down here, it's hard to read, so I'm going to tell you what it says. He was a godly man and an ancient professor in the ways of Christ. He was one of the first comers to this land and the last man who was left from a ship that was called the Mayflower. One of the first guys here and the last one from that boat to live. And he studied the ancient ways of Christ. Right? That should excite some people to think that we are rooted. Here's another picture of his grave. It doesn't even have, it's mixed around with all these other things. So, he was born in 1591. Died 1672. No one's ever heard of him, right? So here's the thing. He was a slave on this boat. He was called indentured servant. He was, in the Bible, a slave is called an indentured servant. God makes a way out. You can only hold somebody as a slave for 7 years, and then you have to set them free, unless they bond themselves to you when it's time to free themselves. That's called a bond servant. They would actually go to the doorpost of the house and run a thing through their ear, drawing blood, saying, I want to be your servant for life. But God makes a way out, so there is no way to hold somebody for life. That didn't exist until later on, and that's a whole other story. So he's a slave. Keep that in mind. And he's on a boat full of people running from religious persecution. Okay? Rough way to go, right? Now, in the cartoon we just watched, he falls off. Now think about this boat bobbing around. They had to raise the sails up because the wind was ripping it apart. You would think that they would be, in their minds, they're thinking, are we in God's will? Are we sure we're supposed to be doing this? Because we just left to come over here to worship God, and we hit this awful storm. We're crammed into a tiny boat. It's rocking around like crazy. They go to the restroom on this thing. There's nowhere for it to go, so it's sloshing around everywhere. People are vomiting on each other. Some people die. Right? And here this guy, a slave, manages to make his way up to the top, and then he falls off. You got to be thinking in your mind, what else can go wrong? Right? I must be out of God's will because all this bad is happening to me. But what happens is, there's a book called Of Plymouth Plantation. It was written, it's a diary, William Bradford, that tombstone I just showed you with God's name on it. He wrote a diary of this whole trip. So he details what happened with this, and it actually happened on a specific day. He falls off the boat. On the way down, because the sails were up, the ropes were hanging into the water. The guy grabs one of the ropes, and he holds on. Now this guy had really, at this point, no real reason to want to live. Because he's a slave on a sinking boat in the middle of a storm, in the middle of nowhere, going somewhere he doesn't know where he's going. Right? So, what reason would there be to hold on at that point? How many of us would let go right now? Right? So, in the book, William Bradford says, it pleased God that he caught a hold of the topsail hailer, which hung overboard and ran out the length. Yet he held his hold, though he was many fathoms under the water, until he was hauled up by the same rope to the brim of the water, and his life was saved. September 6th, 1620. Now keep this in mind. A fathom is almost 2 meters, 6 feet, 1.9 meters. Many fathoms underwater means he was about 12 feet below the surface of the water, being dragged by this boat in a storm. Right? So now you have the water pushing against you. You can't see anything. You can't hear anything. And you're being drugged. And the only thing he had was his grip. But he held on. Why? Because he knew where he was going. So here's the fascinating thing about this is we don't know how long he was there because the people on the boat had to haul him up. First they had to realize he was missing. They're bouncing around the boat too. So it could have been 10 minutes, could have been an hour, we don't really know. Right? But all we know is that he held on in an almost impossible situation. When he does finally get hauled back up, he's still a slave. He's still, nothing changed. He's still the same person he was before he fell over. He's still on a boat that's broken in the middle of a storm. Had to ride it out. But now he has more experience. Right? When they finally come to Plymouth, they land, they have to make this society now. It's a wild area, no one knows anything. They have to make a settlement. Through the first winter, 50 of them die. Almost half of the people die for the first winter. So you got to think the survivors are going, we are definitely in the wrong here. We missed the boat somewhere, right? Because all this bad wouldn't be happening if we were in God's perfect will. But they ended up surviving. They built Plymouth Society. It's still standing. This is the colony. John Howland, the guy that fell over, when he comes back up, he's still a slave. He has to work 6 more years. But he does that, and he earns his freedom. He earns his freedom. So he's no longer a slave now. And he helped build a society. Next thing, he becomes high ranking in the society, and he helps institute a feast with the Wampanoag Indians. What do we call that? Thanksgiving. This slave, with nothing to live for, is directly related to something you do every year. Once that happens, he works his way up to be secretary to the governor of Plymouth. He gets married. A woman named Elizabeth Tilley. They have 10 children. Those 10 children become prosperous, and then he has 88 grandchildren. A slave with nothing to live for, whose only goal was to make it across so he could serve God, now has 88 grandkids. Those 88 grandkids become prosperous. I'm going to show you direct descendants of this man, and you'll recognize some of them. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, George H.W. Bush, George Bush, Jeb Bush, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, he's a poet, Anthony Perkins, Chevy Chase, Joseph Smith, founder of the Mormon Church, the Baldwin brothers, Ted Danson, Dr. Benjamin Spock. Anybody know who he is? He read all these baby books on how to take care of children. Sarah Palin, Christopher Lloyd, Humphrey Bogart. Have I heard of any of those people? None of those people would have existed if he had let go. 3 U.S. presidents would not have existed if this slave, with nothing to live for, gave up. The only thing he had to hold on to was a rope and his faith. And for that, all those people exist. Now, I want to show you something else. This is the country of Slovenia. Right there. This is Italy, Germany, France. Right there, the little dark spot, Slovenia. The reason why I say that is this year, the population of Slovenia is 2,081,000. Why do I say that? Because it's an entire sovereign country whose population is 2,081,000. 4 centuries later, after John Howland falls off a boat, more than 2 million people now can trace their lineage back to him. An entire nation of people exist today because a slave with nothing to live for on a broken boat in the middle of a storm, running from persecution, being drugged underwater, cannot hear anything, cannot see anything, nothing to live for besides I'm going to hold on to this rope and my God. And now an entire nation of people exists because of him. Thanksgiving exists because of him. America was formed. America that was formed out of the northern colonies exists because of this guy. If that doesn't show you how important you are, because you don't know how important your life is on the future. You can't give up. You can't let go. Your life could end up being the blessing of a nation. Jacob became Israel. Right? So think about that next time you're sitting down for Thanksgiving dinner. I bet you'll think about this guy. And think about how bad, whatever it is you're going through now, does it compare? And what was it that he had that you actually have would cause you to hold on? How many of us want to just give up because I lost my keys, or it's snowing today, I'm supposed to do this, or I'm going to go to Kings Island tomorrow and it's raining, and we want to give up on God so easy.
Yes.
And here this guy, knowing, he had to know, even if I come up from this, I'm still a slave. I got to work off my debt. You don't go to the altar and immediately erase everything. You go to the altar, you get saved. You get a guarantee from the king, your life is spared. And what did Solomon say? But you have to prove yourself worthy. And that's where you go to the Laver and figure out who you are. I guarantee you, this guy knew who he was. Being drug under the water, he's like, I'm still somebody. I'm still worth something. I'm going to hold on until I get my life saved. Right? And we have that same God in us. We serve the same God he did. So don't give up. Hold on.